Hey everyone, and welcome to another live stream. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. It is 10 a.m. Central Time here in Iowa, and this is a pretty informal stream. I wanted to get everyone together, get an opportunity just to talk through an actual example of a Next.js application, walk through the code, really go in depth on why things are the way they are. And as always, just give you an opportunity to ask me any questions you have and dive a little bit deeper into things that might be confusing for you. So shout out to those who suggested this. I hadn't even thought about really walking through my repo to explain kind of why things are the way they are, but it's a really great idea. So what I'm going to plan to do today is do a little demo of my site. We're going to pull up the source code, and I'm really just going to step into it as if I didn't even know what I was looking at, right? I'll give you my philosophy of how I would evaluate any other repo, and then I'll kind of walk through some of the different routes that you would see and explain how the code works behind the scenes. Thanks to everyone who's joining. Hey, everyone. Thank you. Feel free to leave in the chat where you're tuning in from. I appreciate you all joining. And yes, this will be recorded and available on YouTube later. So for those of you who haven't seen it, my website is at leerob.io, and I'll just put a link into the chat for this. It's really interesting because I love working on portfolio sites. And the reason I love working on portfolio sites is because it gives you the opportunity to try out new things. So over the years, this site has changed a lot. I went from just plain HTML when I was learning how to code to actually a brief stint using Squarespace because I was sick of editing HTML. So I went to the no-code tools. I went to Jekyll. I went to Hugo. I went to Preact. And now I'm actually on Next.js. And you might think, wow, why did you change it so many times? And if we step back a little, the philosophy of why I have a portfolio site and why you should own your space on the internet is twofold. One, it's an opportunity for me to try out new technology and understand how things work and how they compare to other tools. As you know, as a solutions architect and as somebody who likes to help educate people on programming, I can't really give a good opinion unless I've actually tried these things out myself and have some sort of opinion on what it looks like to use them in a real application. So that's part of it. And number two, I would just recommend to own your piece of the internet. Like you see on my site, it says my personal slice of the internet. I would recommend get a domain name, put something out online, make your mark. You could write about anything. You could write about a little trick that you learned while you're coding. And this puts a footprint out there for people to find you, create that serendipity vehicle so people can reach out to you and collaborate with you. So highly recommend doing that. Thanks to everyone for the shout outs in the chat. I'm glad that you found inspiration for this. And I want to just really give an opportunity to talk about more of the why behind some of the decisions I've made. Tuning in from the Bahamas, incredible. I love the Bahamas. I had an opportunity to visit there and it was absolutely beautiful. Hi from India. So awesome. Thank you all for joining so much. So that's kind of my philosophy behind my portfolio. So just a quick demo. Here's the main page. Shows some of my blog posts that are popular with real-time view counts, some of my projects, and a little timeline just of some things that have happened in my life, all the way going back to being born in '93. So yes, I'm a millennial. I'm 27. And there's a subscribe box, a footer with some information. And you see this actually updates and shows what songs I'm listening to on Spotify. If I go to my blog, I have all my different blog posts. And if I go into a blog post, it uses MDX and Markdown, which we're going to talk a little bit about here soon on why I've made these decisions. That allows me to, write content in a more easier fashion than vanilla HTML. So I have blog posts, I have an about page, I have a dashboard page that has some metrics of mine, including what tracks I listen to on Spotify. So if you have any good song suggestions, throw those in the chat too. And a recent addition that's kind of cool is a guest book. So you can, this is a artifact of the 90s web. So you can go in here and leave comments. You log in through GitHub. I have a future video on this coming soon. So if you want to know more about this, definitely let me know. Hi from Bosnia. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for checking out my course. Really appreciate it. So that's pretty high level overview of just some of the things that are on my site. The thing that I like about it is that it's not too complex. There's not a ton going on. So it's enough for beginners to look at and say, you know, I can work with this. It's not insanely complex where you get confused, but then it has the ability to get larger if need be. So as I mentioned, this site is built with Next.js, Tailwind, and MDX. And Next.js is a framework on top of React. So if you want to learn more about Next.js, you're at the right place. I have a lot of content on that on my channel. The high-level summary is that it just makes developing React applications easier. If we pop over my code, let me know if y'all can read this. I've got the font size increased very high, so hopefully you can read that pretty well. Yeah, so it uses Next.js, Tailwind, and MDX. First, I'm going to talk about just why Next. Obviously, it makes developing React applications easier for myself. And then why Tailwind. I actually have a blog post on this as well, but the short summary is it's one of those things that didn't click for me at first. The whole idea of utility CSS just didn't really make sense to me until I tried it. And then once I tried it, it gave me a new appreciation for it. And so far, I found that I can move pretty quickly using Tailwind, and I'll show you some examples of this here in a minute. And I'm pretty satisfied with it right now. It gives you a decent design system while still just being vanilla CSS under the hood. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. So if I was landing on this repo for the first time, first thing I would do would be the README, and I would check this out. I don't really have a ton here other than how to run it locally and kind of what it's built with. And that's why this live stream is going to be great, because I'll be able to link this here and explain everything that's going on. So the first thing I want to talk about is all of the config files. You see there's quite a few of these files at the top level of the repo. And yes, you can use this if you would like to start out your own blog. The first file I'll talk about is actually my license. So I don't have any confusing licenses. It's basically use this as inspiration. When you copy it, just please make some changes. Like, you can credit it back to me if you'd like. Just don't do it exactly the same. It's a little deflating to see like an exact copy paste with no changes, but I want people to use it. I want people to learn from it. But maybe just change the font size or the colors or, you know, something. I want you to take this and learn from it and be inspired to actually build something. So yes, you can absolutely use it. Hey, everyone. Hey, from Singapore. Is it better to have a personal site like this or something more complicated? The interesting thing here, and I'll touch on this a little bit, is that it's basic, but these same fundamentals that you'll learn if you were to build a site like my own, you can take to build a very, very complex application, which is nice. And a lot of these underlying fundamentals, when you get your hands dirty and you mess around with them, you can take this really far. Hey, everyone. Okay, so we have our license, and another set of config files would be our git ignore. So just what things we don't want to commit to our Git repository. I have a .env file, which is basically, so I have a ton of environment variables, which are just ways for me to access secrets mostly. You don't necessarily need all of these. Like if you clone my repo, you can get rid of most of these. These are for some of the advanced functionality. And almost all of these, I have a blog post about how I set them up. One thing I want to call out here is if a environment variable is prefixed by next public, that means that it's available on the client side. And I'll show an example of that here soon. Going further, another file here is prettier ignore. So I have a prettier setup, which is a code auto formatter. And I just want to ignore these auto-generated directories because there's no point in formatting this code. Which leads me to the package JSON, right? The central hub of my application. When I go visit other people's repos, usually the first thing I check out is the package JSON, just because I want to understand what people are doing. I want to see what packages they have. I want to see how it's built. And down at the bottom of here, so there's a couple different ways that you can do these .config files. A lot of these files can also be inside of your package JSON, or they can be abstracted out into like the dot files on the left side. So for example, I could have a prettier config file on the left side, or I can put it in my package JSON. It's really up to you, whatever you want to do. So this prettier config allows me to have a standardized look for all of my code. I want to always use single quotes. When applicable, I want to have a tab width of 2. This sparks lots of debate, I'm sure. I don't want to have any trailing commas. Really, this is up to you to define what you want your code to look like. And then the awesome thing is if you go in VS Code settings, so I hit Command, comma, and you have format on save, whenever you save your files, it will automatically format them for you. So you can just copy paste code in, hammer away on the keyboard, hit save, and then boom, everything looks amazing. And this saves me so much time. What is my theme? Great question. My theme is Sorcerer right here. Let's see. Is there an ESLint for Next.js? This is a great question. There is an in-progress ESLint config for specifically Next.js related things. So like making sure you use the fundamentals of the Next.js framework correctly, not necessarily like just general React applications. So you could combine those together though to make sure that you're doing React plus Next good if you would like. Lots of questions about TypeScript. When to use TypeScript, when to not use TypeScript. My personal opinion is that for a site like this, if you want to learn about TypeScript and you want that opportunity to explore more, it's a great opportunity. Like there's no harm in adding it. For me personally, I like using TypeScript on larger projects, especially when there's multiple contributors. For my own site, I don't know. There's not a huge need for me to add TypeScript. It's still pretty small. So it's really up to the individual is what I'd say. So let's see. Inside of my package JSON, I have a bunch of different dependencies that I declare. Some of these will be relevant to you, some of them won't. But basically, all of these dependencies are going to be included in my actual production application. And then I have a few that are only used when developing. So if we're doing things like using Remark or generating an RSS feed. Yeah. The next config file I want to talk about is my Tailwind setup. So at my root, I have a Tailwind config.js. And this allows me to do a couple different things. It allows me to specify where all of my Tailwind classes are located that I want to use purge CSS for. And purge CSS allows me to basically only include the classes that I'm actually using. So with Tailwind, it is a utility framework. It includes a ton of different classes for you to do a ton of different things. And when you ship your application, you don't want to include all that stuff. You want to strip it back to just the things that you care about. And that's what this does. I'm using dark mode, which I'll demo here very soon. And I've just overridden the default config with some colors that I like for using typography, which is the Tailwind Pros plugin, which I'll show in a minute. And then also some styles for dark mode as well too. And these specifically are for Pros, Tailwind Pros, in combination with dark mode. Down at the bottom, an important bit here. If you want to use dark mode, you have to set up this variant for the dark typography, and that allows you to do the prefix of dark like this on your CSS class. And then finally, I have a plugin that I'm using Tailwind typography for. What next? JS config JSON. So in my repository, I have absolute imports and module path aliases. Why would I want this? Great question. Let me just open up a random file. Let's say one of these API routes, and don't worry, I'll touch on this later. But you see I have imports that are like this. Well, before absolute imports and module path aliases, this would look something like, this would look something like this. And that's fine, but it's a little bit of an eyesore for me. So the nice thing about JS config is you can, or TS config if you're using TypeScript, is you can set this up so that you can make whatever alias you'd like, and then all the imports are always going to be the same. So this is a nice little handy thing that cleans up the code a little bit for me. Yeah, that's the majority of the config files, except for the next config JS. And this one allows you to do a couple things. Customize Next.js, but also have the full ability to override webpack if you want to. So webpack allows you to bundle your code. Luckily, you don't have to worry about it 98% of the time anymore with Next.js, but Next.js is still built upon webpack, and we want to make it possible so that depending on what you want to do, you still have the functionality to dip into those underlying libraries. So starting at the top, I'm using image optimization with Next.js. And to do that, I have to specify some of these external domains that I'm fetching images from and then optimizing. We'll get more on this later. And then I'm overriding my webpack config, and I'm doing two things. I am running a few scripts when I do my build process. So when I run next build, I'm generating a sitemap and I'm generating an RSS feed. And then this is like a super advanced, you might need it, you might not tip. I'm basically replacing React with Preact only in the client production build. And the reason I'm doing this is because, as I mentioned, my site's not that complex, and I'm not really using any advanced Next.js function or advanced React functionality per se. So using Preact helps me save a little bit of page weight for my initial page load, the initial JavaScript that's served. This is really only for smaller sites. I would say for larger sites, you're probably going to need some of those advanced React features, and I don't know that this would work as well. There's also some confusion about what will be supported in the future as far as this is advanced stuff, but like concurrent mode and suspense, we're not really sure what that'll look like with Preact, but a fun little thing there that you might be able to try out. So first things first, let's just start with our first route, which is index. By the way, I'm hitting Command P to open up files in VS Code. So if I go to our index route, this is the entry point into our application. If you look at my file tree over here on the left, I have pages, and then I have my index file. So when I go to leerob.io, this is the file that I'm seeing. And I try to keep my top level pages somewhat smaller, but you have the ability to let these grow as much as you can. So I have just this home component. And the first thing that you're seeing is a container. This container is essentially my shared layout between all of my pages that allows me to, put margins on the side and set up my navigation bar, do a skip navigation for accessibility, have my footer, all that stuff. And then it allows me just to kind of drop in what stuff I want in the middle. So I wrap it in a container, and this is where you start to see some of that Tailwind code. So you're using JSX, which if you're familiar with React, it's just like a superset of HTML, I guess you could say, and it allows you to write somewhat HTML-like things, except instead of class, it's class name. I don't know. That's a whole nother story, right? But you get to define some classes that you want to add on your elements, and then it's just pretty much like HTML for most of the things, except that you can include React components. So I have a title, I have an H1, H2, I have a link, which is a next link that allows you to do client-side routing. And you might be thinking, how is that any different from a good old-fashioned A tag? And the difference is when this page loads, Next.js says, hey, I see that you're using a client-side link here to go to /guestbook. Let's preload that so that when you navigate, it's really, really fast. And it gives you that single-page app fast transition feel. For my advanced people in the chat, it's turbo links or like the hotwire stuff when people are basically trying to make those transitions really, really fast. Scrolling down a little bit, I have some blog posts, And you notice that these are not using HTML tags. They are using React components. So let's just dive into one of these. Command click will allow me to go into this in VS Code. I have a blog post that is, at its core, it is a link. So it's allowing me to link to an individual blog post. So blog slash whatever the slug, which is just a fancy term for whatever the route is of that blog post. And then I have a little bit of styling here. I have what the name of the blog post is. I have some class names. And let's just pause a second to talk about what some of these classes are. So these are all utility classes that are provided by Tailwind. There's a lot of different ways that you could do this. Some people like to have all the classes on one line, like I do myself. I find this is easy enough for me. There's other solutions that allow you to kind of break this out or organize this a little bit better, where you can sort it by a specific pattern so that they're always sorted in the same way. There's CSS and JS libraries like Twin Macro that allow you to do CSS and JS, but still get Tailwind at the end. Lots of things you can explore. For me, just vanilla Tailwind is fine with me. So I'm using these utility classes to make my text bigger. And I want it to be even bigger when I'm on screen sizes that are above the medium size. And I get to stitch together these utility classes to do whatever I like. And by default, I'm using a dark color that's pretty dark, but it's not all the way dark. And then when I'm in dark mode, I get to use this dark prefix to say what colors I want in dark mode. And the nice thing about this is you get to get really granular about where you want to customize your dark mode styles. So instead of doing like a really high level theme that spans your entire application, you can start customizing things on the per component atomic level. So that's kind of nice. And you'll see that I also have the views here. So I have the blog post views. And the cool thing about this is I'm using a library called SWR. And SWR is a React hook library that allows you to fetch data from remote sources. So in this example, I'm fetching data from an API route in Next.js, which is basically a way to connect to some backend logic. You can, stand up an API, an application programming interface inside of Next.js that allows you to save to a database or do authentication or all sorts of little pieces of functionality, all within your Next.js application without having to go out and set up an entirely separate project, deploy an entirely separate application. When you deploy serverless with Next.js, this actually just gets taken care of for you, and it will deploy all these to separate serverless functions. We can talk more on that later. The TLDR, right? Too long didn't read, is I make a call to fetch the views for this. I fetch the data, it returns some JSON, and I'm able to get the total number of views for this blog post. So that allows me to get views for each individual item. And even when I go to the blog page, you'll see that I'm reusing this same component in a bunch of different spots. If you want to learn more about this and go more in depth and build your own, I don't know why I'm just not using the nice search bar that I built. Real-time blog post views. I use Firebase for this. So there's a blog post on that if you want to learn more. That is a blog post. Let's go back to the index. I also have some project card components, and these are really just, again, another link and some code with some icons. The interesting thing about this, you might be thinking, okay, well, why didn't you just put this code directly inside of your page file? And the nice thing about when you combine React and Tailwind is that you can start by just copy pasting and building out your application. And then when you see those patterns of duplication, you're able to extract that into a shared component. So I always like to advocate for no premature abstraction. Wait until you use it a couple times, and then you can abstract it out to something. Because the agility, well, this also depends on the size of team you're working on, right? For a personal project, the agility is much more important, at least to get started. And then I try to get to the code refactoring and optimizations that I can make. So I have just this project card, which is basically just some JSX, it's just a React component. And I have a timeline and a subscribe. And I think subscribe could be interesting because forms are always difficult. I feel like it's always something with forms, right? So what this component is doing is, if I scroll down, at the bottom of my homepage, I have this subscribe block. And this is a form where I can type in some things, type in an email address, and then click subscribe. And one of the things I want to talk about is there's a few things you can do with good old-fashioned HTML forms that make this experience a lot better. So I click subscribe. I'm using the required attribute on the input so that my browser takes care of telling me that, hey, you need to add something here. And if I put in, something that's not an email, it's going to say, hey, you need to use an email because I'm using the browser, good old-fashioned HTML type to say that it's an email. So let's examine the markup first, and then we'll talk about the actual logic for the form. So most of this is just styling, right? And we're using Tailwind classes to give it a little bit of visual flair. And then I have a form element with an onSubmit. And the magic here with the onSubmit is that I have a button somewhere in the form that's a type of submit. And when this button is clicked, it goes back up to its form and it says, hey, there was a submit event that was fired. We should call this function. So I have an input, and it's using some of the things I talked about, the required HTML attribute to say, hey, you need to fill this out, a type of email, even an autocomplete tag so that if your browser knows that you put your email in here a lot, it will help you autocomplete that, placeholder, and then a ref. So this is a React thing. It is a reference to this element so that we can fetch it and get the value from it. So let's look at subscribe. If we scroll up a little bit here, we have this function called subscribe. This takes in some event, and we want to prevent the default for a form. The default for a form in a browser is to refresh the page. We don't want to do that. We have our custom logic here. And we're going to say, all right, let's start off by putting this in a loading state. When this is loading, then we get to swap out loading with a loading spinner. And this is just using a ternary in JavaScript. So if this is true, then do this. It's just syntactical sugar for doing a if-else statement. So we say, make it loading. Our component will re-render. It will show that loading state. And then we're going to make an API call. So we're going to do a post to an API route for subscribing. This is going to use, can use whatever email service you'd like. And we're going to forward along the value, the current value of the input element as the email. And this is going to be JSON because we're JSON stringifying this body. We call our API. We get back the response. If there is an error, then we're going to say, hey, on our form, we need to tell the user there was an error, and let's return. Otherwise, everything was great. Hooray! You're now on the list. If you want to try this out, just go on my website right now, and I will put in my email, hit subscribe. We see the loading state, and then we'll see a success state eventually there. Hooray! You're now on the list. And I got to go delete that, so I'm not falsely padding my numbers. And what else is in here? We also use ternaries to conditionally render if there was an error message or a success message. And if there's nothing, the initial state, we're showing a link to all of the different issues that I have. So you could click on this and you could go read an archive of all of the different letters that are inside of my newsletter. So yes, I am using SWR for dynamic data only. So I'm using it to fetch information from an API route. And you are correct that data fetching is asynchronous, which is why you have to handle the loading and the error or success states. So when I make this call, we're waiting for the response here, but this component is still re-rendering to put it into a loading state. So I have an asynchronous function that's allowing me to wait for the response to come in and then re-render this function at the same time. What else? So with SWR, this is doing what we call client-side rendering. So on the initial render, you would see, where are we at here? The initial render is this. So if there's no subscribers, we're just going to say hyphen because we're fetching this on the client. There's a couple things you can do here. We're going to get into this more later, but you could fetch this at build time using some of the Next.js libraries if you would like, and then forward that to SWR for the initial data that you show. Just reading through the chat, trying to get caught up a little bit. Hello from Argentina. Firebase makes you sad. That's no fun. Firebase is good. It is a good developer experience. It has its pros and cons. Happy to talk about the pros and cons a little bit more here. It's good for some people. Don't knock it till you try it, I would say. This is a common point of confusion I'd like to talk about. Shouldn't you avoid calling your Next APIs from the component and use get server side props or get static props? So let's just jump into the next example while we're here. I'm going to pull up the blog page. And at the bottom of this blog page, you see I'm using get static props. And this Next.js function allows me to fetch data at build time and get all of the different files, all of my different blog posts, fetch those posts, and forward them as a prop to my React component. So you might be wondering with that SWR example, right? Why was I not using get static props? And the interesting thing is, I'm just going to jump around here a little bit while I explain this, but on my guestbook page, you can actually do both. So we'll get to this later, but I'm using get static props. I'm fetching some information for the initial entries. And then if you go into the guestbook, you see that I'm forwarding this into the initial cache for SWR. So I fetch it every, let me go back one. I fetch it every 60 seconds. I rebuild that page. And then when you're on the client side, you're still doing fetching to fetch the latest information, which is pretty beneficial for certain types of things. This will be recorded, so you can watch it later. Don't worry, it'll be available on my YouTube channel. And yes, I will get into the reasons behind document and app. So let me backtrack a little bit here. We were talking about subscribe, this subscribe block, and on the home page. I think that we've covered everything inside the index route now. And if I pull up, I'm just going to close all of these routes so far. If I pull up my pages, and I'll just close API. So my pages directory, right? We talked about index. There's a few other routes here we're going to get to. We probably won't get to them all, but I'll talk about the important ones. And there was a comment about what are app and document. So these are special Next.js routes that allow you to override the defaults. So we'll start with app. App is shared between all of the pages in your application. So when you initialize one of your pages, this is being used by every single pages. So you notice that I'm setting up my theme, which allows me to do light mode or dark mode. See if I click up here in the top left, I get a toggle between these two. Check out this Next Themes library for that, by the way. And then I set up an MDX provider, which is going to allow me to write Markdown and pass some React components to it, which I'll show in a minute. And then finally, just take whatever component we're passing in and render it as you would. So if you can imagine that index route we talked about, that would just basically be dropped in and replaced for this component. So this will be on every single page. And that's why I do something like initialize my analytics here, which is using a custom React hook that goes out and uses Fathom Analytics. So let me know if you want to link to install Fathom Analytics. It's pretty nice. It's a privacy-focused alternative to Google Analytics. So that's app, right? What is document then? What the heck is this thing? Document allows you to override the initial markup that comes from the server. So when you initially get back HTML from the server, you get to override that and say, hey, you know that HTML tag? Let's throw this lang attribute on here for English. And let's also override the head, and I want to preload my font, which check out my video on web fonts if you want to learn more about this. I want to include a bunch of meta tags for favicons and different links, and I need to do site verification. This is so you can use your site in Google Search Console. You may or may not want that, but and then also I have the body tag that wraps our entire application. So I'm setting my background, what the text color is, etc. Excuse me. My VS Code theme is Sorcerer. You cannot do the document overriding in React because React is only client-side rendered, so just vanilla React. The difference, that's one of the main differences between React and Next.js, is that React is just on the client side and Next.js is on the client side and the server side. So the difference would be like if I go out to my website and I refresh the page, I'll just pull up the elements too. I refresh the page and I'm getting all of this HTML from the server. This is all coming directly from the server. It's being pre-rendered is what we like to call it. With a traditional React application, you serve up essentially like a loading shell for your entire application. And then on the client side, you populate it with that HTML, with that JSX. So that's one of the main differences. If there's two clients open, SWR will make 2 calls to fetch the data, or will it make 1 call and serve the cache data to the other client? So SWR is pretty smart about handling all of this. For example, on my blog, right, I have 65 blogs here. And if you remember, each one of these has its own use SWR hook. So SWR behind the scenes is managing all of the complexity of fetching these APIs, caching their values, and then if I were to like click off this page and click back and somebody else viewed this blog, then I would see that blog go up. So for example, this is 7,269. I click on this and I refresh the page, 7,270. So that's just a TLDR for how that works. And yes, it will be recorded later. You know, I enjoy the contrast on this. People have strong opinions on dark mode, on whether they want it, you know, like true black or, you know, maybe a little bit more gray black. I enjoy it. It's not too bad. Let's go back to our code. So we talked about the index route. We talked about document and app. Let's get into the blog post. So I was just showing this on the screen. I use get static props to fetch all of these blog posts. I forward it to the component. And what I'm doing is setting up React for filtering blog posts. So I use React state to set a search value. So I have a controlled input. And if you see down here, I have this input on change. I'm using React state to control this value. So I set the search value to whatever I type in, and then I'm able to use this value to filter the blog posts that I display. So I take in all of my blog posts, I sort them by when they were published, and then I filter them based on if the title matches the search value. So I use this down below to actually render out all of those different blog posts. If there's no blog posts, another syntactical sugar here, basically, if this evaluates to true, then do this. So if there's no blog posts, then say no blog post found. If there are blog posts, we're going to map, which is just a JavaScript array function that allows me to iterate over all of these blog posts. So for each post, I'm going to render a blog post component. And it's important that we specify a key here because this tells React how to determine which one is unique. I have a list of blog posts. I need to tell React, hey, here's the unique key for each one. So when you're doing all your magic for re-rendering things, you can use this key to figure that out. And yes, my website source code is public. I will put a link for this in the chat right now if you all would like to follow along. This is a really good question because I think it's tough because there's no right answer. Like those are the worst questions, right? There's just no right answer. Actually, while I'm talking about this, I want to talk about a question that was in the way top of the chat that I forgot to answer before we started. So how long should a React component be? And then also, where's that question? Oh no, I can't see anymore. There was a question right when I started about why do I name my files, my React files, why do I name them with capital letters? And this falls into the same boat of like, why do you do that? I don't really know. And what it comes down to is style guides. Part of the reason why I use Prettier is so that I don't have to think about that. I just let Prettier define all that for me. And you can also let ESLint do that for you too. The most popular by far is probably the Airbnb JavaScript ESLint config. Airbnb said, hey, here's the Bible basically for how you should do your applications. If you don't want to ever worry about this ever again, just use this and follow the rules, and then you never have to have these conversations again. But some people are more opinionated than that, obviously. But it at least gives you an idea of why things are the way they are. They are the way they are to enforce consistency across larger code bases. So this component, there's actually, this comment, there's actually explicit rules in these ESLint configs saying your file should be no longer than 300 lines. I don't know. I think that's a load of BS in my opinion. Like, I get it if you're working on a really large scale project, but for me, I usually go by the good old fashioned, if it feels wrong, it's probably wrong. So if I'm building a component and it gets really, really large and I'm duplicating code a lot, then I'll start to think about extracting things out. But it's always a compromise because a lot of people talk about the, don't repeat yourself, dry code, like you don't want to duplicate code, but not as often they talk about the abstraction tax. So basically, if you have to go through 8 levels of components to find what you're looking for, that's also bad. Like, yeah, you might have these small modular components, but it makes it harder for you to understand the entire application as a beginner. So TLDR, there's always trade-offs, and it's up to you and your team to kind of figure out what works the best for your style. Isn't ID better for keys? ID is good if it's unique. I think I use IDs for keys a lot. So you can do that. Yeah. I'll talk about Vercel towards the end of this on where I host and where I deploy my sites. I can also talk about internationalization as well too, but there's some great Next.js documentation on this. Okay, so on my blog post page, I'm just going to go back to this, my blog post page. We talked about searching, and then I have all these different blog posts. And I want to look through and render each blog post. So I have the blog post component. We already talked about this one, but what we didn't talk about was how did I actually get this data? Where does this data even come from? And I'm using this function called get all files from front matter. So let me pull up my Explorer here and collapse all my folders and just step back a little bit. My application has a data folder, and inside data, I have a ton of different MDX files, a ton of different Markdown files. Markdown allows you to write like you're writing any document. So if you've used GitHub, you use Markdown probably. This is italic. This is a link. It just gives you a easier syntax to write structured content instead of having to do HTML. And the difference between Markdown and MDX is MDX, you're using React components in your Markdown, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. There's some pretty cool things that you can do with this as far as like really custom layouts or really custom interactive components. You absolutely do not have to do this. You could use vanilla Markdown if you wanted, but MDX is kind of cool for some unique extra splash that you want to add to your website. So I have all these different Markdown files, right? I have 70 or however many inside of here. And inside of my library folder, which you can call this whatever you want. I like to use library as like, hey, I'm fetching these from external places, or this is like the business logic might be a better word for that. You can do whatever you want here. There's really no right or wrong way to set up your folder structure. It's whatever is most convenient or most clean for your team. And I have this MDX file. So I was using get all files from front matter. Let's inspect this a little bit. Get all files from front matter. This, inside of get static props, it's running in the Node.js context. And what I mean by that is it's running on the server. So on the server, you get to do, or locally, you get to do all the things that you can do in Node.js, like access your file system. So what I'm saying here at build time is that I want to use FS, this node package, and I want to read a directory, and I want to do it synchronously. So I want to do it in a blocking way. So you have synchronous, blocking, asynchronous, non-blocking. So I want to read this directory of data/blog, and I want to get all my files. Then I want to reduce, which this could probably just be a map. But I want to map over all of these files, and I want to then read an individual file. So I get blog/fonts, then I want to actually read the blog/fonts.mdx file, and then I use matter. So this gray matter library. And what this library does is it says, hey, at the top of your MDX file, you did this weird YAML thing. Why did you do this? And the reason that I did this is because it allows me to specify common things that I want to share between all of my different blog posts, like a title, when it was published, summary, image. And we use this to parse it and turn it into a JavaScript object. So then I iterate over all these blog posts and I return all of that front matter data, as well as the slug. So blog/fonts, fonts is the slug. You know, if you talk long enough on a live stream, your words start to just slip together. I don't know that I'll ever get better about that, but I'm trying. So bear with me. Thank you all for hanging out today, by the way. This is really fun. I love doing live streams and answering people's questions. So feel free to just throw me any questions you have, and I'm going to try my best to get back to you as I'm jumping back and forth between the code and such. So thank you for joining. My favorite font, Enter. Check out Enter. It's what I'm using in this. And check out my font video if you want to learn how to use it very performantly. So I fetch all of the different blog posts. This is half of the equation, right? This gets you all the blog posts. But how do I load this page? How do I load this specific blog post at blog/whatever my slug is? And this is where it's actually going to read the markdown and display all of the different content that I want to show. So what I'm going to do is, if you look at my structure here, I have blog and I have blog/slug. And this is doing some magic that we call dynamic routing in Next.js. So this file name with the brackets allows me to understand what value I pass in, read that value, and then use it. So for example, get static props. I get the parameters, and one of the options on the parameters is parameters.slug. So when I visit blog/fonts, fonts is the slug here. And I'm able to use that to then call get file by slug. So get file by slug. Again, we are reading this file from our directory, from the file system. We're using gray matter to parse that. And then here's where some of the interesting stuff comes in. So in my library, I'm using Next.MDX remote, which allows you to fetch MDX from wherever you want. It could be inside your repo. It could be in a CMS. It could be on the moon. It could be wherever you want. We're looking to hopefully improve this story and just like merge this into the official Next.js MDX repository. Let me know if that would be helpful for y'all. But basically, I get the content of this file. And when I'm reading that content, it has no idea what I'm talking about when I throw a React component in there. It has no idea what to do. So I use this to forward the components that I want it to do, so that when I say, hey, I want to use this little snippet that renders like pros and cons. Let me just show a demo of this. Somewhere in here, I have pros and cons cards. Yeah. So inside of this blog post, I have a pros con component and a cons card component. And this allows me to do some really fancy stuff inside of my markup. And this tells that document, hey, here's how you actually use the pros and cons card. Then I have some options for remark plugins or rehype plugins, which essentially allow you to add extra flair when you're parsing your markdown. So like, for example, I can do code titles, which allow me to say what the file name is above it. And I can do MDX Prism, which allows me to do all the different syntax highlighting using the Prism.js library. That's what I want. So I get that, and then I return that information as well as the front matter, including how long it takes to read the article and the word count. So reading time is this npm library, a node library that will basically parse all of your content and give you an estimation on how long it would take to read that, which is kind of nice, just to let the reader know what they're getting into and if they have time for that. So going back to our file, that gets the actual information about the blog posts, like the content. But then we also have get static props. And this is allowing you to tell your application all of the different routes that you have available. So I have 60 some blogs, and when I render out my application, it needs to know about all of those URLs. So I say, hey, give me all of the blog posts and then iterate over those and tell Next.js about all of the slugs that are available. Then if you don't know about it, if you're trying to fall back, what I'm doing here is I'm saying false. And what that means is if I try to access some route that doesn't exist, it's going to 404, which is the behavior I'm expecting here, really. And I use Prism for code syntax highlighting in my projects. It works pretty well. This video will be posted on my channel, and I'm glad that you found MDX helpful. Hey, everyone joining. Thanks so much for joining. Yeah, there's lots to learn. There's always something new to learn, but don't feel overwhelmed. You can learn at your own speed. There's infinite things to learn, right? So really just the way that I like to take it is whatever I find interesting, I dive into, because if I'm interested, it keeps me motivated to actually give a crap and want to learn more about it. So we told our application about all the different paths that are available, and we go into our blog component and we say, hey, here's all the components that you need to use. We're going to take that source that we fetched on the server and hydrate it, which is basically a fancy word for making the components interactable. We're going to hydrate it with those MDX components, and then we're going to render our blog layout. So I've abstracted this out to a separate layouts folder. You could absolutely keep this directly in line if you wanted to, but I like to move this out just to make it a little bit more clean. So let's go into blog layout, and you see it takes the front matter. Inside of this file, I have our good old-fashioned container that I talked about. And interestingly, you'll see that I'm able to override some of these defaults and pass in props. So we had our front matter that defined like the title, the description, the image, all this stuff. I'm able to forward this in to set meta tags about our blog posts. So I'll come back to the container. Actually, I'll go into it right now. Let's look at this container. This is shared between all of the pages in my application. So what I'm doing inside of here is I have a default set of meta tags, my title, description, image, etc. And I'm defining a bunch of meta tags inside of my head of my document to allow me to have better SEO. So this is configuring all of those nice things that make your card look good when you post it on Twitter or when you make it on Facebook or when you share it in Slack. And then going down, I have my nav bar. So one nice thing here is Tailwind gives you a little utility to make an element only visible if you're using a screen reader. So a skip nav allows you to basically skip over your navigation and jump directly to the content on the page, so the screen reader doesn't read out all of those navigation items. Then I have this dark mode button, which uses the Next themes library that I talked about, and that allows you to just quickly toggle what theme you have in your application. This could be anything. It doesn't have to be just light or dark mode. You could do taco mode if you want, and it's going to be, the colors of a taco. And based on that, we change out the SVG. Then I have my navigation, which links to a bunch of the different routes in my application. And then finally, I have the main tag for the rest of my body, the destination of the skip nav. And this will just take in whatever children I want to pass. Children is the fancy word for all of the things in React that are rendered inside of a component. So for example, this next link component, this A tag is the child of it. So going back to my blog layout, I scroll down a little bit. I'm using an article tag, so try to use semantic HTML tags when you can. And I render the title, scroll down a little bit, and I'm using this image component. This image is from Next.image, which allows you to get a responsive image that's optimized kind of out of the box. And I have an entire video on this I'd recommend checking out if you want to learn more, but it's very, very helpful. Then I have the date it was posted. I'm using date functions to quickly take that date and display it the way I like. The reading time, the view counts, which I'll come back to this. And then I have the subscribe we've already talked about, some links, and that's pretty much it. So let's go back to this view counter. It takes a prop for the slug. And I go into view counter, and I'm doing two things inside here. I'm using SWR to fetch the views for the current blog post, but I'm also using an effect to say, when this renders, I want to call the view count API with a post, and I want to increment the blog post views. So fetch the current views with a get, and then do a post to increment those views. So when I go out to this page, well, you actually see that the blog post views refreshed because I'm using SWR. So on refocus on a window, it goes and fetches the latest content. But if I were to refresh this page, it goes up to the next value. And let's inspect this API route because I haven't had a chance to talk about this yet. So if I go to views, API views at slug. So API routes, I briefly mentioned, are a way for you to write an API inside of Next.js and then easily connect to things like databases or authentication, or in this example, Firebase. So what I'm doing in this API route is, if I call it with a post, I want to increment the views. If I call it with a post, we're going to go to Firebase, go to my database, fetch the views, and then find the child for this slug and increment that value and return a 200 with some JSON. So return a 200 with the new value. If I'm doing a GET request, then I want to go to my database, fetch the views, and just a one-time fetch of what those values are. Again, return a 200 of a JSON of what those views are. And again, I have a whole a blog post on this that talks about how you set up Firebase, how you connect things and make this work. So you could use this if you really wanted to build a public REST API with Next.js and deploy it in a serverless manner. So at the end of this, I can demo just how I would actually deploy my site to Vercel. It's very easy. You can just use the deploy button that's in the repo, but I'll do that live in case y'all want to see that. And I don't have a video on how I've set up my VS Code, but that could be kind of interesting. Yeah, if you're having a tough time with LCP and hero images, I'd recommend checking out Next.image to help with some of that optimization. And then, yes, we are working on a blur placeholder that will make the user experience of that a little bit better. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by cool. And I mean, if it's a compliment that you like my OG cards, thank you. If you're talking about dynamically generating cards, I would say you can check out og-image.vercel.app, and that allows you to pass in whatever you want here and generate some graph cards. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. And then I'll also swing back and answer this question while I'm here about adding internationalization. So with Next.js, basically, I don't have internationalization set up on my blog yet, but that's an image. That is not internationalization. But basically, you go inside of your config and you get to define what locales you want, so what languages you want to support, and what the default is. And then you're able to access those values using the use router hook. And you can also do that with links. So I have a whole video on this too if you want to learn more about internationalization. Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Very cool. Very cool indeed. No more Node.js in your workflow anymore. So I am still using Node.js. As I mentioned a little bit, so things like this are using Node.js, my API routes or logic that's running on the server. It's still using Node.js. So I use that quite a bit still. How long have I been programming for? So you couldn't see me there for a second. I have been programming since 2011. So I started programming when I went to college. I actually had never programmed before I went to college. I just thought, hey, this will be fun. I like computers. I built my own computer. I was like, this seems cool. I had no idea what I was getting into. Was very, very overwhelmed. My first semester, I wanted to drop out and never do programming again because everyone there was way smarter than me, and I had no idea what I was doing. So it took a lot of perseverance to get better at programming and learn and compete with other people so that I could actually graduate college. And eventually I learned to love it in the process of it once I figured out what I was doing. So if you're confused or you're a beginner, don't worry. We've all been there. And it's a long road, but there is success at the top of the road. Once you figure it out, it is a great skill to have. It's very empowering to be able to build things that you imagine or you dream up from the ground up. So I do really enjoy programming a lot. And I am 27. Man, that feels old. I'm 27. I know it's not really that old, but it feels old. I don't know. So Next.js uses Express-like syntax. It's not Express, but if you know Express, then you basically know how to use Next.js API routes. Let me find maybe a less Firebase-y. Here's like a really simple API route. These methods should seem somewhat similar to you if you're using Express. They allow you just to make individual routes in separate files instead of having like a one large Express file or however you want to segment that out to do multiple routes. Aside from API routes, what's a Next.js feature that most people don't know about that you think is useful? That's a really good question. I did a 10 tips on Next.js video that covers some really interesting ones, but let me see if I can think of one that's interesting. Something in my code base. I think that not enough people utilize CSS modules. I think CSS modules are awesome. And just to go back in time a little bit here, I used to use CSS in JS a lot, and it's still fine for some things, but I didn't realize how far CSS modules can take you because they do a lot of things that I had previously equated to, oh, that's just a CSS and JS thing. Like that's an advantage you get. Like when you use CSS modules, right, you're only loading the CSS for that component. And it is namespaced to that component so that if you do, a class of container, then it's only going to be relevant for that specific component. Let me see if I can find a good example here. So, for example, inside of this button.module.css, I am saying, hey, we want to define an error. And then in the component, we import the CSS module and we're able to apply this class name. And it's crazy because like vendor prefixing styles with post CSS, which Next does by default, and all of these things that I previously equated to like, oh, I use style components for that. A lot of those things you can just do with CSS modules, and I didn't realize that was all built into Next.js. So would recommend CSS modules if you're trying to figure out what you want to do. A little shout out to a blog post that I have about how should I style my React application. And this uses some of those MDX components I talked about to do pros and cons cards. So lots of reasons here why you might want to use CSS, why you might want to use CSS and JS, theme UI, Tailwind. Try to break it down and be as unopinionated as I can. It's tough though, because everybody has preferences. I think the CSS versus CSS and JS thing is like it's going to be a tabs versus spaces thing that's going to go on forever. I feel like people are very strong in their opinions. The last thing that I want to do on this stream before I kind of call it a day and let y'all get back on with your life is talk about deployment. So my site is hosted on Vercel, and it's a place for you to host your Next.js apps or really any front-end apps and serverless functions, and if we're building APIs or connecting to back-end logic like we talked about. And if I want to deploy this Lerob example, you can just click on this button and it's going to take you into the deployment flow. But I'm just going to deploy like a hello world Next.js project just so y'all can kind of see what that looks like. So I'm going to click on this Next.js template. I'm just going to deploy it to my personal account on GitHub. Be a private repository. I hit continue, and we'll call this, maybe not that. Maybe a few less extra letters there. And then we can deploy it. And the nice thing about this, it's really cool to me, is that this is all through a GUI. Like this is all through an interface. You can use this to deploy Next apps or React apps or Vue apps or Gatsby apps or really whatever you want to do. So we can let this build, and I'll try to answer some questions while we're waiting on that. Do I recommend Chalker UI? Chalker UI is awesome. It is great if you need some out-of-the-box components for doing things like modals or tooltips or other things like that. It's nice that it includes all of that in a opinionated, easy to use, good documentation. I would definitely recommend that. It's totally okay to use Sass if you'd like. I mean, really, it's up to you. They're both good. So my site deployed. It looked like it took about a minute. We got our confetti, which is good, and then we can go visit it. And that's how long it takes to deploy a Next.js app to production with Vercel. So recommend checking that out if you're interested. It's pretty easy to use. What I'm using for my stream setup, all of my gear is listed on /uses, but here's kind of here's the inception of what I'm looking at right now and what you're seeing. So I have some key lights and a Sony DSLR that I use for photography, a Shure camera, or a Shure microphone. Yeah, I like this setup a lot. I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but really it's up to you whether you want to use TypeScript or not. It depends on the project. I think for larger teams, it makes a lot of sense. Is it okay to deploy on AWS? Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend deploying on AWS if you want to have full control over the entirety of your infrastructure. So you want to be able to control everything. Maybe you want to deploy a fully fledged API with like rate limiting and all sorts of fancy features. Like you can do all of that on AWS and be a little bit more bare metal. So depending on your level of comfortability with infrastructure and AWS services, there's a lot of them. It's still a good option if you're familiar with that as well. And yeah, you can do progressive web apps with Next.js. I think package is called Next Offline, maybe. Yeah, I haven't actually used this, but I've seen other people use it. I'm not sharing my screen, so that's a problem. But yeah, I've seen other people use this Next Offline package. I haven't tried it myself, but it says it has 2 million downloads a year. So I think there's definitely people doing it. And yes, I'm running a single monitor. I like it, honestly. My wife in the chat, what's for dinner? That's a great question, Allie. We should make some chicken. That's really funny. She's probably in the other room right now. That pretty much wraps up the stream for today. Just walking through the code. I know we ran a little bit over the hour that I was originally shooting for, but thank you all for joining so much today. This will be available on my YouTube channel if you want to rewatch it. The code, I'll put a link to the code in the description, and feel free to DM me if you have any more questions on any of this. Hopefully it gave you a good understanding of some of the things I'm doing in my repository and how you could build this in your own Next.js application. So also feel free to give me a shout out on what my next stream should be about. I'm going to try to do these a little bit more frequently so that I can answer y'all's questions. So with that, have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Peace.